Hello and welcome to the state of Kentucky. I'm Bruce Maples, publisher of Forward Kentucky, and we're glad to have you with us today. We had lined up two guests who were going to talk about their podcast and their work, talking about autocracy and the rise of autocracy around the world. And for some reason, something has happened, I guess, and they are not able to be with us. I certainly don't have a backup guest other than myself. So I'm going to say thanks for this week. And well, wait a minute. Maybe one of them is joining. Let us see. I hate to be unprofessional, but hold on just a minute and let's see if this person is able to be here. And there's my clock that's a minute behind. Well, we're going to give it a few more seconds. Okay, I think that maybe one of our guests has joined. So let me see if she is there and if we can hear her. Andrea, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Not very well.
Oh, okay. Let me see. How's this now?
That's a little bit better.
Great.
I did not realize you were just doing audio only, so we'll go with that.
Yes, it's been a sleepless night, and so with this news breaking, so I just am a bit behind on things from covering everything. So how are you? How are you, Bruce?
I'm fine. For the benefit of our audience, let me go ahead with what I was going to do in terms of introductions. I'll just play this and then we can go ahead and discuss it. So let me introduce our guests by using an audio clip. I don't usually do the low-tech thing of playing my phone into my computer, but I'm going to give it a try now.
I'm Kendzior, the author of the books Flyover Country and Hiding in Plain Sight. I'm Andrea, journalist, filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller. And this is Gaslit Nation, a podcast covering corruption, drug administration, and rising autocracy around the world.
So, our guest today, we have Andrea with us. Maybe we'll have Sarah. Andrea, if you're using your computer, you want to use headphones or something, you're getting an echo.
Oh, how's now?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you. So I stumbled across the Gaslit Nation podcast a year and something ago. I would highly recommend everybody to go back and listen to the first 3 episodes at least, so that you can get their overview of 2016 election. So I'm fairly familiar with both of you and your work, but for the benefit of our listeners, why don't we do some background work, just sort of set the table for them, and then we can get into the real meat of the questions. Sarah, welcome. I see that you have joined.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Okay, so you two did not know each other before 2015. Do one of you want to tell the story of how you met?
Andrea, you can do it. It's such a beautiful story.
So I unleashed on Twitter that I had heard about a Trump sex tape that the Kremlin had on as compromise on Donald Trump. And I knew about this for several months during 2016. I finally shared it on Twitter with a link of David Corn's interview then anonymous interview with Christopher Steele, and who basically came out with this on the eve of the 2016 election. And I was like, yep, I've heard this too. And then that went viral, of course. And Sarah crashed into my DMs because she heard it too. And we just haven't stopped talking since then. And when our worst fears came true with the Trump crime family, with the Kremlin's help stealing the 2016 election, we immediately got to work because we knew that time was of the essence. We had to stop him from taking power, because once an autocrat is in, it's very hard to get them out, as we're now seeing. And so Sarah and I demanded a vote audit. We were amplifying the concerns and warnings for years by leading computer scientists. We ended, because of the limitations of our system, there was a vote recount, which Trump's goon squad of lawyers clamped down on. We didn't get a vote audit, which is part of the problem of how vulnerable our election systems are to voter suppression, vote stealing, all of it. So, and now Sarah and I just have been trying to warn everybody about how authoritarianism works, how it's the same playbook. It's not creative, whether it's the 1930s Soviet Union or Germany. And people are finally taking our warnings seriously. I don't even call them warnings anymore. It's like people finally caught on. And that's where we are.
So let's back up one more time. Some people, Andrea, may know your last name and be thinking, I know that name. Why would they know the name Chalupa?
Well, because it's an adorable last name. All right.
Okay.
So number one. Number two is my sister, for a very long time, spent her whole career at the DNC. And in 2016, she, as any Ukrainian American, we're proud Ukrainian Americans, as part of this country's rich history of being a melting pot. And, in 2016, when Paul Manafort came over to manage Trump's campaign, we knew who Paul Manafort was from all of our years of following events closely in Ukraine. Paul Manafort is Putin's operative. Having him manage Donald Trump's campaign meant the Kremlin was essentially managing Donald Trump's campaign. And my sister tried to warn both Democrats and Republicans about this, and no one would listen or take her seriously. So she broke rank and went to the press, and she got a bunch of press for it. And that picked up speed on finally breaking through the sound barrier, getting attention for the Kremlin Trump story in 2016. And Republicans, especially Paul Manafort, never forgave or forgot that. Neither did the Kremlin. And they've been hounding her and attacking her. She's been viciously attacked by Fox, by Sean Hannity, by Kremlin state propaganda, all of it. She's been harassed in her home. She's been hacked. And the Republicans made her central to their impeachment defense. Devin Nunes said her name dozens of times in trying to rally targeted harassment of her for essentially alerting her country about the Kremlin's attack on our democracy. And it's been relentless, and it's been horrifying. And it's been, unfortunately, what's been going on to a lot of men and women who've been sticking their necks out as patriots trying to defend our democracy. And she's just a statistic of so many victims of the Trump crime family, the countless families that have been harassed and deeply hurt and targeted by their abusive policies, by their abuse of power and criminality. So
I want to get into why both of you think we are moving toward autocracy, and let me know that I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I'd like to first start because I think some people who are unfamiliar with your work may need some background. So why don't you tell us why people listening today should pay attention to the two of you? What's your background that gives you any insight into this?
Sure, I'll start with that. I have a PhD in anthropology, and I spent my research studying the former Soviet Union, studying authoritarianism in former Soviet republics that became independent states like Uzbekistan. One of the main things I looked at is kleptocracy, which is when a dictator abuses executive power to enhance their personal wealth. Before I got that degree, I worked in New York tabloid media. I worked at the New York Daily News. I was there from 2000 to 2003. I saw how Donald Trump manipulated the media. I saw how the media itself is not a trustworthy actor and often works to abet some of the most corrupt people in power. That's why I temporarily quit and went into academia, came back out, went back into working in the media, and started writing about the decline of the United States, about the erosion of our own institutions, about our battered economy. And I live in St. Louis, Missouri. I don't live in New York. I don't live in DC. I don't want to live in those states. And I felt like during the election in 2016 that people in those cities, journalists in those cities, did not understand how difficult the quote unquote recovery was after the 2008 collapse, what a hard time most Americans were having, and how the pain that people are experiencing in most of the country could be exploited. And so when Trump emerged, I thought, you know, here is someone who actually does understand that there is this level of pain and knows how to exploit it. He doesn't want to remedy it, but he knows how to manipulate it for his own ends. And his main motivation is greed. And he's not a unique actor in that respect. I think that kind of applies to the majority of our political officials and certainly of other officials worldwide. And so when you add all that together, I was in a very unique vantage point to observe this, which is why I thought he would win the primary, he would win the general, he would govern like a kleptocrat, he would use authoritarian tactics. The Mueller probe and other attempts to constrain him would not work because there is so much corruption throughout the entire government. You know, Trump is a symptom of a broader disease, and it's the disease that I'm most concerned with.
Okay, that's for you. Andrea, what about you? What gives you the insight to bring us an opinion?
Well, I think everyone has a right to an opinion, but we all have to be grounded in the facts. And so for me, I researched Soviet history in college. I lived in Ukraine in 2005, shortly after the Orange Revolution. So I became very familiar with the inner workings of Ukraine and its struggle against corruption and how the Kremlin wielded corruption as a weapon inside Ukraine, how kleptocracy works, all of it. And during this period of around 14 years, I was researching and writing a screenplay inspired by my grandfather who survived Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine. And this screenplay was about this brave young journalist, real-life journalist from Wales named Gareth Jones, who risks his life and career as a young, inspiring reporter to sneak into Ukraine and report on the devastation of Stalin's genocide famine. And he blows the lid on this big story. And he's ultimately discredited by the Kremlin and a corrupt Western journalist by the name of Walter Duranty, who was the Moscow bureau chief in the New York Times and denied all this in the Times itself. And so this film that I was writing, researching, I produced it. It's directed by the great Oscar nominee Agnieszka Holland. It stars James Norton, Vanessa Kirby, and Peter Sarsgaard. It's available now on Amazon and iTunes and other places. And it's this compelling real life story about how autocracy works, how dictators wield the weapon of propaganda, and how this all depends, the success of these efforts depend on Western corruption, which they happily exploit. And all of this is a mirror to our own times of how Donald Trump rose to power with the help of Kremlin propaganda, how he himself became a vehicle of Kremlin propaganda, and how, quote unquote, credible reporters, even at the New York Times, helped him do this. And so for me, it's just been this horrendous, surreal reminder that history is a mirror that we're forced to finally learn from, or we'll just be stuck here again.
Let me remind everybody that if you comment on Facebook and YouTube, we can see the comments. We may show them in the broadcast. So let's get to today and what you both have been saying. There's a phrase that you have used a number of times in your podcast of an international crime syndicate masquerading as a government. Why don't you give us some examples of why you say that?
Okay. Well, to understand that phrase, which is something I've been saying frequently and is also in my book, Hiding in Plain Sight, you need to examine the broader network of actors that surrounds Trump and his circle. And this includes people in his immediate family, like Jared Kushner and his daughter Ivanka Trump, who was nearly indicted for fraud. But mostly, if you follow back the trail of Trump's financial dealings, you find that he has been bolstered by and working with the Russian mafia going back into the 90s, and before that, the Italian mafia in the 80s. And then, Giuliani's crackdown on the Italian mafia led to the Russian mafia moving in, needing to launder their money, looking for people like Donald Trump, people who work in real estate, casinos, other places, where that money is laundered. This is very well documented. This was in the public domain. You can find articles about this going back into the 90s. It seems to have been forgotten, I think in part because of The Apprentice, because that was such an effective whitewashing tool at trying to reframe Trump, who had, used to be infamous for his bankruptcies, his tax evasion, his, hanging out with the most sordid criminals. It made him look like a successful tycoon. But to make a very long story short, Trump is linked to the Russian mafia syndicate run by Semyon Mogilevich, who used to be on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted, is seen as profoundly dangerous, is involved in a number of criminal activities that aim not just to enrich himself and his circle, but the Western order. These are threats to our national security, our safety. And we have seen when Trump came into power that his loyalty does not lie with serving this country, but with enriching himself. And in doing so, working on behalf of the Kremlin. Because when you look at the Kremlin, you have to look at it as a multi-pronged apparatus. You have the actual government officials, people like Putin. Then you have the oligarchs, who are very similar to our corrupt plutocrats here in America, who got rich off of exploiting what remained of the former Soviet Union. And then you have mafia actors, organized crime, like Mogilevich. And, Trump is their Trojan horse. Trump is a way for all of these corrupt individuals to make a lot of money, get rid of barriers that were getting in the way of criminal activity or of illegal moves, like, for example, when Putin invaded Ukraine. And then you see other countries caught up in this too, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the UAE. There are lots of deals being made, lots of ways people do things like pay down their massive debt. We saw that with Jared Kushner, for example. It was Qatar that paid off his debt, and he abused his position in the White House to do that. We see very typical things that you see in authoritarian kleptocratic states: installing your children into office, making trade deals that have nothing to do with protecting America or bettering America, and everything to do with pocketing the money, letting coronavirus spread, and then making money off of the fact that states didn't have adequate medical equipment and had to get into bidding wars for it. There's so much, but that's the mentality. It's different than Hitler or Stalin or other fascist dictators, because they lack even that basic loyalty to the state. America is just a land mass and a resource mass that they want to strip down and sell for parts. And that's a very frightening situation for all of us who love this country and don't want to see this kind of suffering going on unabated.
So would you say that it's more a threat of the greed, and that's causing the power grab, or have we moved to a point where the power grab becomes the point?
It's both. When he first came into office, it was to, for this, I don't know, it's always the same three reasons. They want power, they want money, and they want immunity from prosecution. That's another thing that's important to understand, is that a lot of these mafia operatives were being looked at by the FBI, looked at by, even the International Criminal Court in some cases. And this gives them a tremendous ability to override any threat of prosecution. This is elite criminal impunity. And you see this with like Jeffrey Epstein or people like that, who just ran around for decades committing crimes while nobody bothered to hold them accountable. And so I do think Trump's main goal was always greed and enrichment. He's not an ideologue. He's not coming up with these big plans. But then different people saw him as a useful vehicle. Putin sees him as a wrecking ball towards America. Mitch McConnell sees him as someone who can, help the GOP basically become a one-party state, or maybe make America a one-party state run by the GOP. He understands the bureaucracy. You know, these terrible ideas don't come solely from Trump's mind. You know, a lot of people contribute to this, and a lot of people have all sorts of different goals. And to some extent, this is, you know, an extension, kind of a really dramatic extension of what some Republicans have wanted since the Reagan era, which is basically just to destroy federal government, shrink it down to very small parts, a kind of social Darwinism where they don't care so much about who gets hurt in the process, and so on.
So, Andrea, I want to pursue something with you because of your Ukraine background and your studies there. I read an article the other day that said that the United States is not heading toward being a failed state. It is already a failed state. And the writer was from another country that had gone through 20 years of civil war and pointed out people have this idea that when your state is failing or when autocracy is taking over, that your daily life will dramatically change. And this person was pointing out it changed from the standpoint of the things that happened around you, but you still went to work, you still went out to eat, you still did these other things. And people, this writer said, I'm worried that America thinks that Germany in 1944 is the signal that autocracy is here, and in reality, it's much more subtle. So, Andrea, why don't you address that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that's why people had a hard time taking our warnings seriously back in 2016 and 2017 and 2018. They would still go to the grocery store and they would see plenty of food, people shopping for food. It would be a normal sunny day. Everything felt normal. And what you have to understand that in an autocracy like Turkey, or even Ukraine under Yanukovych, and even Russia, you can still go to the grocery store. There's plenty of stuff in the grocery store, and the sun still shines, and you can have a beautiful wedding, and you can have an office party. Life is normal. But where life becomes abnormal and dangerous is the law bends according to the whims of the powerful. So, for instance, in Ukraine under Yanukovych, a couple kids were riding their bike and this is a story from a friend who had just gotten back from there. And he said, you know, a couple kids were riding their bike and they got mowed down by some people who had the right connections. And so they got away with murder. So God forbid if your kids should get mowed down here in America and the people who did it have the right kind of friends, the right kind of power, the right kind of money. And that's what happens is if you get in trouble or if you're somebody who wants to run for office because you want to exercise your political voice, or you're a journalist uncovering stories, your life's in danger. Your family's lives are in danger. They will come after you. They will harass you. And what people don't understand is that that autocracy becomes a gilded cage. It's a gilded cage. And we're already there in the sense that there's such widespread voter suppression deliberately engineered by the Republican Party. And that's deeply symbolized in such a horrifying way by the Supreme Court right now, where you have 3 justices, well, 2 active justices and 1 potential new justice, 3 judges who were involved in helping George W. Bush steal Florida in 2000. That was an election that set the world onto this destructive course, which led to the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, fallout that we're still living with today. And they're being rewarded for that voter suppression. They're being rewarded for helping steal that election in 2000 by now being on the highest court in our land. And what we warn is that in autocracies, once the ruling abusive party, because in an autocracy, it becomes a one-party state. There's the party. And once you have an autocracy, the party takes control of the courts, that's game over. Once they have control of the courts, it's very difficult to get them out. You get into this vicious stalemate. Look at what is happening in Venezuela. You have the opposition party trying to work all powers of procedure to leverage taking back power, and yet they keep getting clamped down by corrupt judges and the police state and other machinations. So we're in a very precarious time in America, and every victory that they win to further consolidate consolidate their power sets us back, which is why we have to still do everything we can in our power to call up the senators on the Democratic side and demand that they fight like hell to delay the nomination process. They have to find any sort of mechanism they can to delay the nomination process. Because if we get one more judge in the Supreme Court, that's going to be devastation we're going to be living with for at least a generation.
So let me ask you what you need to be doing into that. And I know you have an action guide on your website. Hold on a minute, Andrea. Mute your mic because we're still getting that feedback. Let me put this up for anybody who's wanting to know. You can go to gaslitnationpod.com, and that's the website, and there's an action guide, and there's some other things like that. Sarah, just take a second and explain the name. I know what it means, but there may be some listeners who don't understand the name of the podcast.
Yeah, to sum it up, when you're gaslit, it means that you are being told that something is or isn't happening in the face of all objective reality. You're being told not to, believe your own eyes and ears. You're being lied to in a very brazen and blatant way that causes you to question your own sanity. And when that happens in a country, when you have the executive branch lying constantly, being untrustworthy at every turn, changing their story dramatically, it leads to that feeling. And it's often very helpful for building an autocratic society because people give up on the idea of truth itself. It's not just that they don't believe anything. It's like they don't want to bother to find out anything because they're just exhausted. Their psychological capacities are worn out. And we're certainly seeing that today, with the Trump having COVID story breaking, and you see every different interpretation possible of whether he has it, why he has it, what's going to happen next, because people don't live in a shared reality, and they've been bombarded with falsehoods and propaganda and conflicting narratives for, at least 5 years. And it really does a number on you. Russia is also a gaslit nation. It's a state that is structured this way, where Putin went from censoring content to bombarding people with so much bad information and so many confusing, gossipy narratives that it's very difficult. Like everything seems possible, and that leads to both paranoia and credulity, and it's very bad for the body politic in general.
So let me ask you both. I've got basically two more questions. One is, tell me or tell our listeners one or two things to watch for over the next 4 to 8 weeks that would indicate to you that we are in the next step of becoming an autocracy.
Well, one thing I'm worried about is the criminalization of protest or just simply gathering together. I think that this is going to be a heavily contested election. So that's something to watch out for. But we've seen executive orders, from Trump and from Barr that want to criminalize just basic peaceful, nonviolent sorts of protests that have decided to label groups like Antifa, which isn't really a group, as a terrorist organization, but then just label random people who happen to be near the protest or participating briefly in a nonviolent fashion as being Antifa members. And this is straight out of the dictator's playbook. I watched this happen in Uzbekistan, for example, and it inhibits free expression, it inhibits protest, but it also just shows how far they'll go to just target kind of average people, not people like setting targets, setting any kind of store on fire, things like that. Just regular people who want to express their voice and stand up against what they see as a tyrannical government. If they're going to be criminally prosecuted for that, then we're in very dangerous territory.
Andrea, how about you?
Agree completely. I saw that happen with Ukraine, where Yanukovych and his party passed the so-called dictatorship laws, a series of laws outlawing constitutional rights in Ukraine, like freedom of assembly, journalism, the right to investigate those in power, and so forth. And that just further fueled the revolution in Ukraine because it was just such a sweeping power grab that citizens disregarded the laws completely. And they put their freedom and their lives on the line to go out and protest anyway. And I think Americans have to understand that because we lost so much time in preventing it, we lost so much time. We could have done so much to guard against our election being stolen in 2016. And there's a lot that we could have done that we just didn't do. And now the longer this goes on, the more dangerous it becomes for us, including those who dare to go out and protest. But that's where we are now, where people are taking very serious risks, bodily risks, just showing up to protest. But at the same time, that is also what is required at this point in order for us to confront this and remedy it.
So let's throw out the case, which is that Trump either wins the election or it gets challenged. Obviously, you've already pointed out that sending it to the Supreme Court, particularly if the court is 60% conservative, is very concerning. Let's assume that happens. Let's assume that somehow Trump gets another 4 years. What should we be doing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question because, the GOP and Trump's backers in general think ahead. And I think, the retirement of Kennedy, the replacement of him with Kavanaugh, that was deliberate. That was one of the court packing moments because Kavanaugh had said, no matter what, Trump will never be indicted. And that happened when the Mueller probe was ongoing. So they've had this in mind. They've seen, the Supreme Court as a means to override the will of the public in a contested election. The same thing happened in 2000. It's a very tough situation. This is what we've been trying to avoid. So my advice is just always, for people to tell the truth, to stand up to power, remember your constitutional rights, don't surrender in advance, make your voice heard, and also look at, different levers of power, your local elections, your local court officials. It's not the end if this happens. I think it's like they're following a playbook and it's natural that they're going to move to that stage in the playbook, but don't just like throw your hands up in the air and be like, all right, we're in full autocracy time. You have an obligation to this country, to your community, your society around you to fight on behalf of the most vulnerable citizens, to fight on behalf of people who are suffering. It's not about getting revenge against the Trump administration. It's not like a battle. It's not a game. It's our lives, and they're playing with our lives, but we need to do what we can, to protect ourselves and each other. And part of that is simply not backing down and preparing for a very long haul fight to take our democracy back.
Andrea, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think that even in autocratic countries, local elections are a great way for resistance movements to grow and build movements. And you see that in Russia, you see that in Turkey. And so I think local elections, who represents you in your state capital, running for office, taking yourself very seriously as a candidate for office. If that's something you've never thought of for the first time, guess what? So many people are making that decision across the country right now because they understand how serious the situation is. So I think our best bet is for us to be our own saviors and for us to run locally for office, take over local governments, and that will provide a buffer against this Republican-led effort to be a one-party state.
So for my next to last question, let me ask both of you, is there anything that you wanted me to ask you that I didn't?
No, I think you got it.
Yeah, and if people want to dive in more, go to gaslitnationpod.com, where we have an action guide and also a reading guide with books we recommend, including novels that give a greater perspective on how autocracy works and how we got here.
Excellent. So here's my last question, and either one of you can go first. In the midst of this horrendous time in American democracy and in the world, in the midst of a pandemic and an election that looks fraught with issues and all of the things we've talked about, what gives you hope?
I mean, I don't really think of things in terms of hope or hopelessness for that matter. I just think of them in terms of resilience, perseverance, that you need to know what your moral values are. You need to know, what you will stand up for and stand up against. And then you just act from there and just sort of try to center yourself in that way and block out the noise. And there are plenty of things to give you hope. You see people standing up for each other. You see people trying to pursue the truth, even in very difficult circumstances. But I think this is a time where we all kind of need a lot of, inner strength and fortitude and realisticness about the situation. It's not going to be easy. So you just gotta, you gotta get tough and get serious and be ready to ride out the tough times to, hopefully get to a better ending.
Andrea?
Yeah, and I would add that what gives me hope is just seeing all these people run for office for the first time and determined to flush out the corruption in the system by becoming a part of the system. That's what we need. If all these idiots can run for office, like none of us have an excuse. All of us have to show up and do something and be a part of reforming this corruption. And so that gives me hope, and all the people helping them run for office, all the people making phone calls and text messages and writing postcards and letters, that is what's going to save us and pull us out of this. And it's never been more important. And this is the energy we have to build and maintain and bring more people into the system, because that's how we ultimately take back our country, building a more progressive union, state by state, county by county.
Well, on that, I think we need to end. That is what we're trying to do at Forward Kentucky. I know that is what both of you are trying to do. I encourage our listeners to go subscribe to the Gaslit Nation podcast. I encourage you to go to the Gaslit Nation Pod website. And if you really want to be supportive, you can go buy Sarah's books and watch Andrea's movie, and that'll be good as well.
Well, Bruce, we want to thank you for having us on, and we look forward to you and your whole movement helping Kentucky become a swing state and then a bright blue state.
I hope so. Sarah Kendzior or Andrea Chalupa, thank you so much for being on the State of Kentucky. Stay safe and take care of yourself.
You
Thank
too.
you. Thanks for having us on.